the purpose of ancient structures. And he came to this knowledge through his work in the seed business. And he was actually already working in a business that enhanced seeds through electromagnetic energy. And he would be visiting sacred sites, and he realized that perhaps there's some potential also in the sacred sites with some type of energy that would have an effect on seeds. And they actually did some testing and got some instruments, and they found that that was so. So I find it very beautiful and fascinating that even in a tiny little seed, we can have a window into the wisdom of the ancient past. And so now John will tell us a little more about that.
Thanks, Heidi. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to be a little off the beaten path, I suspect, today. I doubt you've heard of what I'm going to be talking about today. But I'm going to be talking about one of the functions of megaliths around the world. And what I began to find as I got initially interested, as Heidi just described, was checking the chronology, checking the location, and working with geological maps, taking instruments to these sites. I found that pretty much all over the world where I could get to, these megalithic builders chose overwhelmingly to site their creations on top of certain types of geological structures which are known to dramatically enhance the natural electromagnetic fluctuations that take place everywhere on the Earth every day as just part of the changing geomagnetic field. But then they further designed these megaliths in ways that would further concentrate those energies and built them out of materials that would help accomplish that. And that may have been for many purposes, but I'm going to present a circumstantial evidence case today, I guess, that one of those purposes was improving food production. And if you look at the chronology of these places, most of them were built at a time when farming had been going on long enough that there had been soil exhaustion had become a dominant problem, because these were places built in days before either fertilizer or crop rotation had been discovered. And let me just ask you this. Essentially, if you were an Indian farmer in the United States, which is what I'm going to concentrate on today, the United States, and you planted 40 seeds per row in your corn plot, and this is what you harvested at the end of the season from your 40 seeds. But your neighbor next door, in his 40 seed rows, he harvested all of this from the same number of seeds of the same type of corn. And you had seen him paddle off in his canoe with a whole bunch of seed early that spring and come back a few days later, and whammo, he suddenly got seed that grows like nothing you've ever seen. What would you do next spring? My reaction is I'd tail my neighbor until I found out where he was going with my seed, get done to it what he had done to it, and come back. So we're going to be exploring that particular effect predominantly in North America. My book deals with sites all over the world, but I wanted to talk about, in particular, the U.S. today, because I think a lot of us have the idea that to visit megalithic sites, you've got to get on a plane, you've got to go to another country. But the reality is that 2/3 of the American people live within a few hours' drive of one of these type sites. And in fact, our book indexes many of those sites that are still open to the public today. Now, what do I have to aim at when I click? Straight up. What? That's what, but that's not the next slide. while we're getting the technical stuff worked out, let me talk a little bit then about what I'm going to concentrate on is two classes of megaliths in the United States. Number one, Native American mounds, which were built in the thousands all the way up the Mississippi Valley and into the Ohio valleys and under tributaries. And in addition to that, these stone chambers or rock chambers, as they're called here, throughout the northeastern United States. Great. This is a map done in the 1850s of identified Indian mounds at that time. The vast majority of these have been plowed over by farmers so they could farm the ground. But there are still hundreds of them left in the United States, and I was able to visit numerous dozens of them. And this is the northeastern U.S. into New England. This is where you tend to get these stone chambers. So that's what I'm going to be concentrating on, and also with a short dip into the Mayan pyramids at Tikal, because the forces I'll be talking about really come together very nicely there. Also, the same kind of stone chambers that were built in New York and New England, virtually the same identical type structures were built in the Old World, running from Ireland all the way to India over a period of 6,000 years. And if these were thousands of them over a 6,000-year period, now if these were a cultural artifact, you have to stop and realize that there was no culture that covered that area for 6,000 years. So perhaps some of these were being aimed more at a functional motivation in their building. So let's get at the mechanics of how this works. This is a simplified schematic of the Earth's magnetic field. It acts as if there was a bar magnet inside the Earth with one end at the North Pole, one end at the South Pole, and you have the magnetic field lines emanating out. Except in the real world, in space, it doesn't work that way, because we've got the solar wind, the highly electrically charged solar wind, interacting with the Earth's magnetic field lines. So the sun, which would be over here somewhere, as the solar wind hits, it compresses these field lines here. It squeezes them down. And when that happens, it shortens the field lines. It makes them stronger. And at night, the opposite happens. Hold on. At night, the interaction of the solar wind on the dark side of our planet stretches out the field lines into a very big, long, elongated pear or a teardrop shape. And that weakens the field lines. So I used three basic types of scientific instruments at these locations that I surveyed with my partner and co-author. And one of them was a fluxgate magnetometer, which measures the change in these field lines at any spot on the Earth where you want to stand. The second one was an electrostatic voltmeter, which measures the electric charge that's present in the air at the site. And the third one, finally, was specialized geological electrodes, which you simply stick in the ground, connect with about 100 feet of wire, put a voltmeter in between, and you can record the electric current that's flowing through. Because what happens, literally, everywhere on the Earth, every day, is that as our spot on the Earth rotates from the light side into the dark side as night falls, the magnetic field lines weaken. And you can measure this in your own backyard with one of these instruments. It's everywhere. That it weakens further, and then in the hours approaching dawn, it starts to rotate back to this position, and these elongated field lines come snapping back like rubber bands that you've let go. And there's a sudden surge in the strength of the geomagnetic field at your spot at that time. Now this does something vital. It creates electric current in the ground and in anything present that will conduct electric current. It's the physics principle involved is called induction. And it's actually how all the electricity that we use is generated in our power plants. The energy in the power plants is mostly just to turn a giant magnet past a whole mess of copper wiring. And the changing magnetic field as it goes past the copper wiring generates the electric current that gives us our lights and heats our homes, etc. So there's nothing mysterious or esoteric about this. This is straight physics of nature, if you will. So I'm talking to you about how the ancients managed to pick out certain sites which magnified these energies, particularly these dawn surges, if you will. And how did they do it without magnetometers, etc.? Well, the simple answer is they could feel it. Almost everybody here can feel these changes if they're strong enough. Some people are much more sensitive. And again, these kind of special geological structures that I'm talking about will magnify the effects several-fold. So if you're sitting in a spot like that, not only is the ground carrying electric current, your brain conducts electricity very well, and that's carrying these fluctuating currents as well. And it has some very unusual effects. This here is Bear Butte in the Black Hills, which was the most sacred site for the Sioux and a whole series of tribes that have lived there. And it's still an active religious site used at night for vision quests today by 3,000 to 4,000 Native Americans a year. Whites are only allowed in the park by day. By night, it's an active religious site. And the reason why is it's a perfect place for these kind of fluctuations. Geologically, this is a dirt-covered version of Devil's Tower, Wyoming. It's a volcanic plug with lots of metallic minerals in it, therefore, including lots of magnetic ore, magnetite, which is iron with a magnetic aspect to it. And for at least 150 years, the Native Americans there have been bringing people, hold on, did that again, have been bringing people to the top and sitting them down for just even one night as being sufficient for some very powerful visions. And this included Crazy Horse, who would have his visions here on the top of Bear Butte and come down to this meadow in the morning where his people would gather and he would preach his visions to his people. We went up with a magnetometer and found that these brightly colored cloths tied to trees that you see scattered around everywhere on the mountain, wherever we found a magnetic anomaly strong enough for our magnetometer to pick up, some shaman had found that same anomaly and had decorated it with a particularly dense cluster of these colored flags. And he didn't miss a one. We surveyed this whole butte, and every single magnetic anomaly had been marked, sometimes by these, sometimes by medicine bundles hanging from trees, and on this one, in fact, a piece of amber and a clamshell offering, which 1,000 miles inland was probably a pretty important offering. On the top of the ridge, it's a razor-shaped top, a very narrow ridge top, that's got 5 magnetic anomalies. 4 of them are shallow pits, just big enough to sit in, surrounded by low stone walls, just big enough for somebody to sit in for the evening, but not enough room to lay back and go to sleep. The 5th anomaly was the most powerful one by far, and that's this one here. There was a sleeping bag stashed in a tree nearby, and this was about a 5-foot by 5-foot enclosure which had these willow sticks, which don't grow anywhere on Bear Butte. They were imported. Before they were blown down by the wind, when this was being used, the willow sticks were upright in these piles of rocks with these particular flags on them. And we frankly didn't know what the hell we had found when we stumbled into this, but we had a strong sense that it was important. So we photographed it, we took copious notes, and a few days later, a Crazy Horse monument in a Sioux bookstore got lucky enough to stumble into a 1960s era description of a guy on the Pine Ridge Reservation who'd gone to his own shaman asking for help in kicking alcoholism. And he'd taken him up here and put him into an enclosure exactly like this, every detail, right down to the last detail. And the visions this man describes having in the hours approaching dawn, which is when these natural electromagnetic fluctuations are at their strongest, were truly mind-blowing type of visions. He never drank again. It worked. And essentially, this exact same set of flags with the same colorings facing the same cardinal points was invented by Crazy Horse's spiritual mentor, who was a childhood friend of his and a shaman. So it's a 150-year unbroken tradition on the Sioux Reservation. And if you recall, in all their battles with the white man, the one place they insisted on keeping was the Black Hills. Now, the kind of special geology I keep talking about is commonly called a conductivity discontinuity, and that may sound very exotic, but it's pretty simple. Some ground conducts electric current better than others, either because it's high in water or high in metals or something. Where one bit of ground that conducts electricity well meets another piece of ground that conducts it less well, that border is what they call a conductivity discontinuity, because the current flowing through the ground from these daily magnetic fluctuations of the Earth's magnetic field, they hit a barrier here, so to speak, and the nature of what happens there will increase the strength of these fluctuations by several hundred%. And the magnetic anomaly means a spot where there's more magnetic iron ore there, which is a very good conductor of electricity. So it's creating, if you will, a minor one of these. Now I'm going to start talking about the mounds now, because essentially I think we've just addressed the question of how could these guys 5,000 years ago have picked out these spots. And this is one answer as to how. This is England, and it's just because it's a pretty mound to help demonstrate what we're talking about here. This is Silbury Hill, the largest man-made mound in Europe. And when you build a mound, you do two other things. I'll get it down. You concentrate all the charge in the earth. And by the way, this is also built on a conductivity discontinuity, as is Avebury Henge, a half mile away from it. You concentrate all the charge spread out in the ground into a much smaller space at the top. And it's usually negatively charged current. What it also forces is the natural atmospheric field potential lines, the electric lines of field potential, it's called, in our atmosphere, which are predominantly positively charged. They have to come, they end up pinching down to meet the sides. So when you build a mound or you build a pyramid, you're forcing a concentration of the positive charges in the atmosphere and a concentration of the predominantly negative charges in the ground. And up at the top of those, sometimes in those hours before dawn, with these instruments, you can record some very dramatic changes. Now, the reason I picked this particular photo is to show you, if you can just make it out, they actually dug a ditch, a henge ditch, around the base of Silbury Hill. And that means that effectively they were separating the hill from the rest of the ground, except for certain areas where they would leave the ground undisturbed. It acts as a bridge. They're called causeways, and this would be called a causewayed enclosure. And what that does is it channels the ground current as it's flowing, just the way a breakwater channels water in an artificial harbor when the tide is running. The tide coming in hits that breakwater, the water runs along it, sinking the path of least resistance, and at the mouth of the harbor, which is the gap between the artificial rock breakwaters, when the tide is running, that's where you get these tremendous currents as a result, because you've got it all concentrated in this small area. And we took measurements at Silbury Hill for a week with all three of these instruments, and we charted exactly all these effects there. Now, wait a minute. Now I'm really out of line. Okay. I'm going to show you in a couple of minutes that the Native Americans did the exact same thing, that all throughout the Midwest, you had large mounds being built by the Indians, up to 60 to 100 feet tall, and you had a lot of these henge ditches built as well. A henge, by definition, is just a C-shaped ditch, and the gap in the C is where things concentrate then. And you'll see in a minute that this was practiced all over the American Midwest. But first, I want to take you to, Tikal, Guatemala, oldest city of the Maya, and a place where we thought, wow, if we got these results on, earthen pyramids in America and smaller mounds, some of the results we had seen, just, what could we get, down here, where they were obviously pretty sophisticated and advanced. And this is a quick tale, but a very sad tale in the end, of lost knowledge of an ancient civilization. Because we did the first thing that most visitors to Tikal do. We went to the King and Queen's Pyramids, which are, World Heritage sites. They were the rebel base in Star Wars. You might remember them from there. And we figured, wow, this is where we'll really get some action. Now, by comparison, there were other less spectacular pyramids that we ignored at first. But this is the chamber at the top of the King's Pyramid. We set up shop each morning at about 3:30 in the morning. We were taking flash pictures too, because we've noticed that at a lot of these megalithic sites, flash pictures will reveal an abnormal amount of what some people call balls of light or orbs that we believe are simply balls of electrically charged air. And they reflect, they're so weak, they're the same as ball lightning, only they're so much weaker they don't glow, but they will reflect the light of a flash. You see one tiny little one right up here, but that's about all. We set up our instruments, put some seed out here to expose it to these energies, and sat there for the next 7 hours being incredibly disappointed because, electrically speaking, this pyramid was as dead as a doornail. There was nothing happening here. And believe me, there's nothing tougher than sitting for 7 hours staring at a meter that doesn't change. As we found out later when we got back to the States, there was no effect on the seed, no improvement on the seed either. And so we scratched our heads and did what we should have done on first arrival, which was read the guidebook. I now highly recommend that. Now, what we learned from that, written by Michael Coe, the eminent Mayanist, was that this was one of the King and Queen's Pyramids were the last pyramids built there, circa 700 AD. So I started reasoning that, well, what about the first pyramids built here? The first arrivals would have their pick of ground, and if there was electrical, energetic ground here, they could build their pyramid on it. This, by the way, was a look down the steps of the King's Pyramid with a flash during that endless night, and again, showing almost no balls of light. So what we found out was this very humble-looking pyramid, which is called El Mundo Perdido, or the Lost World Pyramid, because it sits on a separate mini plateau behind and beyond the Grand Plaza. This one is alive, and this was the first structure ever built in Tikal, the first major city of the Maya. It's actually a cultural bridge to the Olmec, therefore. And the whole little plateau that this sits on is incredibly electrically alive. We surveyed this several mornings, and on one of them I got readings higher than I've gotten during thunderstorms in New York, to give you an idea of what we're talking about. In setting up shop there, we found that in the pre-dawn darkness, flash pictures would be absolutely choked with these balls of light. But that as the dawn started to approach, the electrical charges start to drop, and so does the presence of the balls of light. And this is just two of a whole series of photos. But it was nice and gratifying to see that as the natural concentrated electric charge at the top of this pyramid was high, so were the density of these balls of light. As they dropped, they became much scarcer. And you can see here in the foreground some of the seed that we put out and some of the instruments that we set out and monitored. So here's the result of the seed experiment. This was the control kept in the hotel room the entire time. And what we were lucky about was that this was some traditional Mayan seed grown today, and we bought this in a highland Mayan town in the mountains, which means it's much weaker seed than the kind of stuff an American farmer would buy from Monsanto, for example, today. The modern seed that we have here, when we exposed it to these electrical energies at these structures, was improved, but usually improved a dozen%, maybe at most 20–30%. Whenever we used the ancient seed stocks used by the builders of these things, the increases were much more dramatic. And again, to remind you, the reason we thought this might work or might happen is because our business was working with a technology that basically subjects seeds today to a very laboratory-controlled version of the same kinds of energies that we're dealing with here. So here's the control. I think it's 30 seeds or something. You see most of them didn't even germinate. Here's the seeds we put in that electrically dead King's Pyramid for several hours. They're actually doing a little worse than the control, possibly because it was a dew-filled night. And then the next slide is the first set that we put on top of that flat-topped Lost World Pyramid, which was built in 500 BC and used until 1000 or 800, I guess, AD. So it had 1,300 years of continuous use and was enlarged 6 times. So clearly they appreciated it. And this is what we got with the first batch of seeds we put there the first night, when it was showing modest electric charge, but definitely better than the King's Pyramid. There's some more germination. You see in particular the increased uniformity, which is typical of what we get with our artificial version of it. But the last set this is the one put out on the most electrically charged night at the Lost World Pyramid. And again, you see not only dramatically higher rates of germination, but again, incredibly improved uniformity. Now, it's not magic. We had years of biochemical investigations with university labs in the United States to find out what's going on inside the seed that does this. And it's, without giving you a long technical explanation, it basically ends up making the seed at the cell level more vigorous in exactly the same way that jogging or any aerobic activity makes our cells more vigorous right at the cell level and better able to withstand the next stress that we run into in life. That's the core of what it does. It has to do with free radicals and antioxidants. It knocks down your free radical levels and raises your antioxidant levels. And so we know that's what's involved here. We know it's what happens when we do it artificially, and we've done the same tests on the seeds that we've brought to these places, and it's the same thing happening there. So now, just again, the reminder that when we're dealing with mounds, we've got something that's, if you will, akin to a pyramid as far as its shape goes. And these were that was the slide I was trying to find before. This is various ones from 1850s in the Midwest. These were ditches being dug. And these are where there were little gaps in the ditches where the ground current would be concentrated coming through the ditches. And these little dots that you see just inside the entrance to so many of these ditches are mounds. So the Native Americans knew enough to be concentrating this energy first by making these ditched enclosures, because the vast majority of this ground current flows in the top meter or two of the ground. You dig just a 2-meter deep ditch and you've stopped most of it, and it'll flow around and look for an unbroken piece of ground. And well, let me back. I just wanted to point out here that some of these things are on a huge side. Some of these, I don't know if any people in the front can read it, but you're talking about dozens of acres inside these things. Some of them went on for kilometers, in fact. But almost all of this has been plowed over today for farms, yet there are still dozens of sites that you can go visit. The Serpent Mound is one such site that's pretty famous in southern Ohio. It sits on this highly unusual limestone bluff above 2 streams. And it's in a very geologically unusual area called a crypto-explosion crater. We put seed out on the surface of the mound one time, and we got improvements, but they were kind of modest improvements. Two members of our team went back on a later date and put some more seeds out on 3 different locations, several batches of it, and we were lucky in that a lightning storm started to close in. Now, under normal circumstances, the serpent mound is geomagnetically unusual. It's got higher strength magnetism, if you will, than its surrounding area. But as the thunderstorm moved in, the electric currents that get concentrated by this, what they call peninsula effect in geophysics, started to raise the magnetic fields much more dramatically, and also the electric charge in the air. And this is the chart of the results of the change in modern bean seeds. Now, bean were one of the staples of the Native Americans, but essentially this was the control kept in the car. And these were 3 different batches, and how far they had grown at, I think maybe 5 or 7 days or something after being germinated. And these were batches done 20 to 30 at a time. They were analyzed for statistical significance, and the differences did come out, significant enough to be published in a journal, for example. And the one that is highest is the last sample retrieved as the lightning was closing in. So the one that was subject to these forces the longest is the one that showed the most dramatic improvement of growth. So I just wanted to show you Tikal because those results are so dramatic, but we're dealing with the exact same thing with what took place in thousands of these sites in the United States. And another case, okay, I mentioned earlier, ancient knowledge lost. In Tikal, Mayan farmers today still bring seeds to the top of the pyramids, spread them out in the pre-dawn hours, and take them home. We know because we kept finding them there. And it's known that Mayans come out of the rainforest for these rituals pre-dawn. The sad part is that they take them to the wrong pyramid. They take them to the big fancy King's Pyramid that attracts all of the foreign tourists and everybody else. So a custom survived of, you bring your seed to the top of the pyramid, but unfortunately I guess, secret knowledge that was held by an elite perhaps there was a chain of knowledge that was broken. And nobody knows that all they've got to be doing is walk in a few hundred more yards and go into that much humbler looking Lost World Pyramid, and they could be getting dramatic results. With the, now I'm going to jump ahead now, okay, to the rock chambers, the stone chambers in New York, okay. Here the physics is a little bit different, but the effect is very much the same. These are things that are called dolmens in Europe, or sometimes fogus in England and France. In the old country, I showed you how they were spread across most of Europe by the thousands and were built for thousands of years. They've all got the same design. It's just hard to describe. And they're littered. There's hundreds of them throughout this part of New York and up through New England. But they only occur in magnetite country. They only occur in places where there's natural magnetic ore buried in the ground. And this is one of them. You see, this is the typical of the structure. They're usually built into hillsides, so they look like almost nothing from outside. But when you get in, the closest way to describe it is it looks like an igloo with a truncated dome at the top, and then the biggest flat stones they could find stretched across as the ceiling stones. Those stones are very disproportionately also the most magnetic stones that they could find. And this particular photo is from a friend who introduced me to these. And this ball of light here is what showed up on an infrared photograph. And nobody has any idea what it was. Nobody there saw it. This is a non-flash photo taken in the daytime. But something that looks like a heated ball of energy in the sense that you see it's got almost a tentacle-like structure to it, which is very common for plasma, electrically ionized air. You often get little tentacles in that. Anybody, if you've ever seen a plasma ball in a toy store with kids where you put your hand on the glass and it attracts those little bolts of electricity to your hand, it's the exact same physical process. Works the same way. This is another one which today modern archaeologists want you to believe that this 40-ton boulder is a glacial erratic that just happened to land right on top of these upright rocks and form a little chamber, and furthermore that it happened to land directly on top of a magnetic anomaly that's right there, also right at the border of a conductivity discontinuity. It's just funny things happen out there. What was interesting to find was that the people who introduced me to these chambers included a geologist and a physicist who had access to really state-of-the-art magnetometers from Columbia, Doherty, Lamont Geophysical Observatory, which is connected with Columbia University. And this is a magnetic contour map that he made of one of the chambers. This is a stylized view of the chamber. Every single time you find a negative magnetic anomaly right outside the front door of the chamber. In other words, a spot where the geomagnetic field is actually weaker. And in fact, you see that it was nestled into an entire area of such places. That was being very deliberately sought out in dozens and dozens of these structures. Now, I have to apologize because this one is upside down and I couldn't figure out how to turn it around. So use your imagination, okay? This is a door of a chamber, and what I couldn't get over was why the pointed roofs. They're in Ireland, they're in France, they're in New York. There must be some purpose to these pointed roofs. And after a while, it began to remind me of an old-fashioned ice house where they have the pointed roofs. At least we had them back east in the old days. And it's designed to let the hot air, which is lighter, rise, and allow the colder air, which is heavier, to sink and sit on top of the ice so the ice will last longer, basically. So I started to wonder, is there anything electrical that could be involved in a similar separation type structure? And it turns out that the two most common ions, meaning ionized or electrically charged molecules of air, that the most typical ones you run into in Mother Nature are negatively charged oxygen molecules and positively charged carbon dioxide molecules. And the carbon dioxide being heavier sinks, and by comparison, therefore, the oxygen rises. And sure enough, when you go into these places with the electrostatic voltmeter, the air near the roof is always more negatively charged and gathered in a low level, maybe 1 foot thick layer at the floor. It's much more positively charged. And furthermore, it sets up a pulsing, little pulses of exchange taking place between these positive and negative zones. And we began experimenting with bringing seeds to these places, just leaving the seed out on the dirt floor for anywhere from 20 minutes to a few hours, and began to get sometimes modest increases, sometimes statistically significant increases with modern seed. Now, what I found also was that you didn't get these results in these places unless the pulses were taking place. You can watch them on a good electrostatic voltmeter. And the pulses had to be over a sort of minimum strength in order to produce these positive results. But when you did that, we finally built up to, through an ethnobotanist at Harvard who specializes in keeping the ancient strains of seed alive that were grown by Native Americans, we got hold of two types of old seed stock, Tuscarora corn, and what you're going to see, and you saw at the beginning of the picture, was Iroquois flint blue corn. And those two were grown up and down the eastern seaboard of the United States from 700 AD onwards, which includes the time that these chambers were being used. And when we put them, we did one grand experiment with putting 3 different samples of each into each of 3 different chambers on the same day, and then taking them out. So we had samples that were in for about 20 minutes, samples in for about 60, and the longest was in for 75 minutes. We also then had controls in 100 feet outside each of the chambers, controls in the cars, controls in the laboratory. And all this got planted by the ethnobotanist and grown out organically. This was one of the chambers involved that we used. And here you can more see that dome-like or igloo-like structure I was talking about. But I got very lucky. This was beginner's luck. My first visit to this place, the thing that clued me in on the electrical aspect was I snapped this picture, then I crossed the road to get a close-up of this unusually shaped stone, and I snapped this picture, which a lot of the detail is lost. But this, it actually has an internal structure that looks like a deck of cards when a magician, shuffles them dramatically like that, and for a moment they're all laid out parallel to one another but separated in the air. We've seen that again and again with situations, and it does show up naturally in plasma laboratories. When you've got electrically charged air confined to a tube, it often separates itself into those separate type planes. And what was interesting was that arc occurred right here, right over my blue backpack, which had at the moment inside it the electrostatic voltmeter. And that voltmeter was effectively fried. It was sent off scale positive, and it took 6 months for the charge to bleed off enough to where I could use it again. And by the way, near Silbury Hill in England also, I had my first one fried, and when sent it back by something that was circling the hilltop we were on, that we couldn't see, but we could track it. And when I sent that back under warranty, I was informed by the manufacturer that they'd give me a new one because it was non-repairable. It had been damaged so badly. So that was the first hint that, okay, maybe there's something electrical going on here. The main question is, why do people go to such trouble to build those things, not only there, but all over the world? And one analogy I like to think about is, what are the biggest, most intensive and expensive structures that we ourselves build today? It has to be hydroelectric dams. You think of the Great Gorges Dam today, the Aswan Dam, the Hoover Dam in this country. They dwarf anything else we build, and we invest huge amounts of resources, effort, time, money, etc. into building these enormous structures. Why? Because we know we're going to get a very physical payoff from it. We're going to get electricity, which is the lifeblood of any industrial civilization. And what I'm proposing here is that one function, but by no means the only function, of these megaliths was, and the reason people in those ancient times were willing to invest such staggering amounts of their own resources, was that they also knew that they could be getting back from it some real physical reward in the form of increased fertility, which is the lifeblood of any agricultural civilization. And that's exactly what we're dealing with there. You know, today if we have a famine in the breadbasket Midwest, no problem, we import more food. We exchange money for food, we buy it. These are civilizations that couldn't do that. Things were barter, things were local, and it was all about subsistence farming. So what I'd like to those say is, well, I think there's a case clearly to be made here for the fact that that was a major purpose, perhaps, in building many of these structures. It was certainly not the only purpose. As you've seen, these same forces were known to affect the psyche and had been used for vision quests by even pre-agricultural civilizations. But I think if you take this in context with everything else you're hearing here this weekend, you're hearing right now one more blind man describing his own piece of the elephant, if you will. Okay. So I'm going to leave you with that. I just wanted to just remind you again, you could plant this, and you could plant and get this, or you could plant and get this. The people who did it on the biggest scale were in Cahokia, Illinois, which was the biggest metropolis in the history of the United States until about 1800 or so. 30,000 Native Americans in one place, which was more than most of the European capitals at its time. And they are the builders of the biggest mounds in the Americas. Monk's Mound the one in the distance there, is 100 feet tall, and it's football fields long. In volume, it's something on the order of about a third the volume of the Great Pyramid at Giza. And these were built by Native Americans lugging baskets of dirt one at a time up there and dumping them, up there and dumping them, to make these mounds. Now, with all the mounds that I surveyed in the U.S., with the exception of a couple, everyone was built right on top of a magnetic anomaly. This entire structure here, one of the curious things archaeologists wonder about it is most of the pyramids at this site are built in two parallel lines, several hundred yards apart, and nobody has any idea why. They thought it must be functional or ceremonial. It took me 3 days of nearly losing my toes to frostbite to figure out that no, what this is one large conductivity discontinuity. There are zones on either side of it. Over here it's higher geomagnetism, over here lower, and right in here is the transition zone. And both of those lines were transition zones of the same strength. And that's, if you do a contour map of it, as is in my book, you'll see how the major pyramids there lined up directly along that. And somehow they were able to feed 30,000 people in one location at a time when there was no fertilizer and no crop rotation, and you normally exhausted the soil in just a few years. So the one thing I'll leave you with is the fact that, again, lost knowledge. By the time Europeans got to the Americas and they got to these mounds and they asked the Indians living nearby, wow, who built these? The answer was always, we don't know. When we moved into this territory, these things were abandoned, and we don't know any more than you do what they were built for. With one exception, which was the Natchez tribe in Louisiana. And they were still continuing their tradition of using the mounds. And a Jesuit missionary there in 1803 wrote home to his superior to tell him that no farmer here would dream of planting his seed without first carrying it to the top of one of these mounds for certain blessings. And these along with the other mound builders, have something odd economically in common. They imported luxury goods from all over the continent, and there's nothing that anyone can find that they exported to pay for it all. It's the mysterious trade deficit of the Hopewell and Mississippian cultures. And I propose that the missing difference could have been seed. Today, you can, in Africa and Zimbabwe, you can get a shaman there to bless your seed in return for 10% of the seed. And that doesn't show up in an archaeological dig as anything worth taking notice of. So clearly these sort of things were happening not only in exotic places around the world, but right here in the good old USA. And if you want to look in the appendix of our book, you can see many dozens of locations that you can still drive to, even right here in the United States. So again, it's the same tradition we're talking about at this conference, and it's an American example. So thanks for your time.